And now, while our speakers are leaving the stage, we'll prepare for our final panel discussion of the day. If Brett Solomon, who will be facilitating it, and the speakers would like to take your seats on stage. You met Brett earlier in the day. He'll be facilitating this panel discussion, which will examine the implications of emerging technology for internet freedoms, democracy and free speech. And Brett will introduce the speakers in just a moment. A reminder that you can also submit questions for this discussion through the Slido app. Over to you, Brett.
Thank you very much. So, that was a really fantastic panel. Thank you very much for the one that preceded us. It's always excellent to put many of our issues into perspective, and it was, I thought, so articulate and well argued and explained. So thank you. This panel is, as Alan said, it's the last panel for the afternoon. There'll be some keynote speeches and rounding up after this panel. The title is "The Invisible Revolution: Utopia, Dystopia and the Many Faces of Tomorrow." And we have an excellent panel here who are assembled to discuss the topic. Michelle Guthrie is the Managing Director of the ABC. Dr. Tobias Feakin is the Australian Ambassador for Cyber Affairs, and Professor Joseph Cannataci is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy. So we essentially have a UN representative, a government representative, a representative of the public broadcaster, and a range of different issues that they are experts on, from cyber to privacy to the future of the media. And so I don't know if we're going to find out what the future is, whether it's utopic or whether it's dystopic. But if we think about it, on one hand, we've got, from the Utopia side, we've got freedom of expression for billions, near healthy populations everywhere, from telemedicine and biohealthcare. We've got education and information for all, regardless of your gender, your location, your disabilities, your identity, all on the one hand, on the utopic side. And then on the dystopia side, we have the complete surveillance state, mass employment and as AI replaces workforces, censorship and content removal at the whim of the state and the all-powerful tech companies, geolocation of populations controlled by drones and algorithms, fake news, and the end of the ABC. So if you think about it yourself, I'm going to ask the panel where they sit on the spectrum, but let's have a little bit of a show of hands and see which of you is feeling more utopic than dystopic. Who's feeling that technology is more Jetsons than Black Mirror? Raise your hand if you think we'll become more democratic as a result of technology, more equitable, more free. Okay. And then on the other hand, who is feeling that we are entering into a period of dystopia? Who's feeling that technology, the future is more Voldemort than Harry Potter, more fake news than open access to information, more WikiLeaks than Wikipedia? Okay, everyone in the middle, raise your hands. So maybe we can use Slido for that as well. I think you can do graphs and you can do this anonymously so we can see. Also, I mean, it'd be interesting to see at the end of this conversation if you've shifted at all. So what we're going to do is we'll do some just opening remarks and introductory comments. Let's start off with the Australian Ambassador for Cyber Affairs, Dr. Feakin.
Government rep. Yeah, hello, good afternoon everyone. Great to be here. Thanks very much for having me along. Just say a little bit about my background actually, because it's quite interesting still 18 months into this role, which is the halfway point. Essentially, my job is to coordinate and be the central government point for how we engage on cyber affairs broadly defined. I'll describe a little bit about what that's about in a moment, but do you know, even 18 months in, I still find it quite interesting to be now, obviously, the government rep. I've spent a career outside of government researching and understanding technology, looking at new and evolving technologies and where they fit within societies, where they fit within organizations, and how do you build good policy around that in order that you can absorb, if you like, the positives and mitigate the negative effects that they might have. So it's fascinating taking that 20 years now, which is scary. I'm realizing I'm getting into my middle age now. 20 years of that kind of research and now applying it into a government role and trying to ensure that you not only embody government positions, but you also embody what we define as the multi-stakeholder approach, which for us is the only solution to pretty much everything that we'll discuss, I guarantee, as we move along. The only way of truly solving these problems is through consultation, through cooperation, rather than thinking that any one of us actually has the actual final answer to the problems or the opportunities that we face. And I think that's where I'd start. You asked for a show of hands on opportunity. Is it a big opportunity, and the kind of utopia side or the dystopia? I mean, the reality is probably somewhere in the middle, but I would shift it far more towards the utopic side, if you will. Really, we are benefiting economically, in a societal way through certainly the online environment in a way that we could barely imagine 10, 15 years ago, and the kinds of positive enablements allowed by the online space and advancing technologies is, as far as I'm concerned, pretty transformational. Yes, it becomes slightly worrying when you start looking 5 years out on the horizon and start truly understanding the kind of connectivity rates that we'll be enjoying at that time and the kinds of ways that might shape, even inadvertently, the lives that we lead. But still, ultimately, that presents us with fundamental societal opportunities. And so that's the way that we've, if you like, set this roll up, and myself and my team and government have set this roll up, which is that really what we're concerned about is the fundamental opportunity that we all have in cyberspace, and how do we, as Australia, ensure that opportunity is fully enabled and allowed to flourish. So the way that we've set this up is, we want to have socioeconomic development benefit. We want to ensure that the positives that we know exist in the online space continue to do so, but whilst addressing some of those negative issues that we know that will damage that. So we want to ensure that there is a better, higher bar of cybersecurity, not just here in Australia, but internationally as well. We're only as strong as our weakest link. We want to ensure that cyber criminals have as limited operating space as possible to rip us off in our daily lives, or to take that to more industrial levels. We also want to ensure that states have as limited operating space as possible to exploit, which we're seeing increasingly in the international environment. States are increasingly pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable in cyberspace, and we think that's important to address that, because all of those things will have a deep impact on the positives that we all want to gain. But a fundamental part of this is about reinforcing that, as far as we're concerned, the human rights aspects of this are vital to that benefits, to the beneficial side of what we're looking to enable in the online environment. And essentially that's about saying that human rights apply equally online as they do offline. And that's not always necessarily an easy discussion with many of the partners that I work with, but it's an important one, and something that we continually put on the table and ensure is very present in both our discussions and our approaches to our international relationships, be they bilaterally or multilaterally.
I actually wanted to ask you that, because let me just ask, did anybody know that Australia actually had a cyber ambassador here?
A few. I've got to be better at promoting this.
So, I mean, it's an interest. I mean, I asked that question because I think, if anybody in Australia is going to know that this ambassador position is here and that we've appointed somebody in that position, it would be this crowd, which means that, and it's not just about sort of sensitisation, but it is recognition from the Australian government that we really do need somebody to engage internationally on a cyber strategy, that the cyber strategy impacts us domestically as much as it does regionally and internationally. And within the cyber strategy that Toby's team has developed, there is a piece on human rights and democracy, which I would encourage people to read, as would he. So how do you, and I think it's great that you talk about opportunity, but really my understanding of cybersecurity is about management of risk. And so how are you actively bringing that chapter of the strategy on human rights, which is the topic of this conference, into cyber? How are you ensuring, for instance, and we talked earlier about issues of encryption and government hacking, and not just defensive capacities, but also offensive capacities in relationships with other states and against other states, and we need to look no further than the US and Russia to understand the severity and importance of this. How are you ensuring that human rights forms the basis of our cyber strategy?
Sure. Good point. First of all, I think I need to do a better job so next year when I come back, if Ed actually invites me back, there's a few more hands at least going up, and genuinely, I'm putting this to you. This is a multi-stakeholder position. This isn't just about being an Australian government rep. The best that I will be able to do for Australia is that I am informed by as many different positions as possible and ensure that I can encompass as much of those opinions as I possibly can. It's a good question. How do you bring human rights into a discussion like offensive cyber capability? That sounds like a pretty scary topic, doesn't it? But what you will see from Australia's perspective in the way that we've put this into our policy, we are one of the few governments that's actually said, yes, we have this capability. And actually, yes, here are the limitations on how we use it. We use it within a very strict international legal framework. We have international norms, which we've published in the back of our strategy. We're pretty much one of the few countries to have ever done that, which means that we're saying we have a standard that we operate to, and we're willing to put that into print. And it's not that we're trying to create some sort of new warfare environment. What we're trying to say is that there are other countries that are doing this too, but they're unwilling to have that conversation transparently about what the limitations should be. Because we think a very dangerous situation to get into is that states begin using these capabilities against one another without any kind of confines and restrictions in the way that they do. Now, that may sound almost counterintuitive, but it's to us very logical that if the capability is there, we need to discuss it. We need to have transparency with other countries in order that we don't endanger broader interests and concerns from society. But in terms of the kind of core element of human rights, how do you bring it into the conversation? To be frank, it permeates everything that we do. So, I can't name names in terms of countries, unfortunately, but so many of my bilateral conversations, and especially in, if you like, the Asia Pacific especially, one of the first topics that comes up is fake news. What are we going to do about this fake news problem? And there is a real compulsion to control, and you can see that countries are very quick to look at legislative responses. How do you begin to shut down? How do you begin to censor online voices? And so, the reply is enshrined in our approach to human rights, which is actually we feel that, there is a freedom of expression issue here. It's a basic human right to be able to express yourselves online. So we would not want to see legislation going into place which shuts down the ability of individuals or groups to be able to express themselves online. And that is the case in many countries that I have conversations with. And so, to be frank, we have a whole range of projects that we fund and work with third parties, NGOs who we feel do a really great job of exposing some of the quite draconian activities of some countries and making sure that there is more transparency in the discussion in terms of censorship and the limitations of the individual's rights to accumulate and converse online. We're part of the Freedom Online Coalition, which again does a good job of work there, and so we think there's a whole kind of range of ways that we can do that. But it's about making sure that it's in your mindset when you're having any given conversation.
So thanks for that. And I don't underestimate the challenge. It's undoubtedly the case that we have a cyber engagement strategy. We have a cooperative research centre with an allocation, I think, of around $50 million, which is in play. But we're still struggling with this interplay between what we do in Australia and what we do as part of our foreign policy. And it might be a good opportunity to bring Joe Cannataci in, who's an expert on the international system. And you talked about international law and international frameworks and how we comply with our international obligations. How difficult is it, and maybe, Joe, you could begin with some introductory comments, but thinking also as to what Toby said, the ambassador, is how do you deal with states compliance with international human rights law, and particularly in relation to privacy, but perhaps in relation to some of the other rights as well? And what are some of the challenges that you're seeing as we head to either this dystopic or utopic future?
Well, thank you for that, and good afternoon, everybody. Well, I think the answer comes on two parts, with difficulty and with enormous patience. I don't envy Toby his job. The difference between Toby and myself, I suspect, is that, like himself, I was rather surprised to find out what I'm doing today, because I spent 25, 30 years before that trying to sort out governments discussing things with each other. And that introduces you to the games people play. And Toby can't say it because perhaps he's either too polite or else it's because his job prevents him from saying it. He's got to be fairly diplomatic. My job now, having spent so many years enduring the games people play at the diplomatic level, is to speak truth to power. That's my job. My job is to remind the states, and Toby's here representing a state, and one of the better states rather than, although of course we could spend a long time discussing Australia's great need to improve things on the privacy front, on the domestic front. But since we're going to talk about the international front, we have to reflect about what really happens out there, right? And if you ask yourself the question, are states behaving in an appropriate manner in cyberspace? The answer, in many cases, happily not all, is no. Are states carrying out surveillance in cyberspace on hundreds of millions of people at least? The answer is yes. It's not only offensive cybersecurity we need to talk about. We need to talk about all the things that are carried out in the name of national security, for example, but which lead to the useless surveillance of hundreds of millions of people. And the truth is that Toby is out there on a limb. The truth is that Toby has got to go and meet the people he can't name, but which I will, right? Yeah, come and look me up for a drink at the bar and I'll tell you. You see...
Stage now.
And on stage, and on stage. I'll take you up on the challenge, Toby. You see, but when you come to look at appropriate state behavior in cyberspace, there are a bunch of problems which at this moment in time haven't been dealt with. Those problems include jurisdiction. Those problems include sanction. Those problems include telling the awkward squad and telling them to come in and behave. Those problems include how to get them to behave. Those problems include how to make sure you manage to preserve national security while at the same time upholding the best standards possible in human rights. Because, as Toby was saying, privacy is out there, freedom of expression is out there. There are a whole bunch of freedom of religion, freedom of association. There are a whole bunch of human rights out there which have got to be maintained, but they've got to be maintained in a way which is respectful of the truth. And it's a very difficult game to play. And at this moment in time, the truth is that the international system is close to breaking down. The truth is that if you look at what we call the GGE, the group of government experts in New York, which was entrusted with discussing how to apply international law in cyberspace, in June of 2017, they failed. They failed to come up with further progress on the progress that they had genuinely achieved beforehand for 4 years. And they were then not convoked again for 2018. Now we might have something for 2019. Let's see what's going to happen. But at the same time, their attention was so focused on things which relate to cybersecurity and the application of humanitarian law in cyberspace that subjects like privacy got pushed to one side. They had a mention of privacy in 2015, but since then we've heard very little. And my job is to remind them about that. My job is to try to get them, especially the good guys. And the truth, when you meet ambassadors like Toby, and now I can clearly speak, it's the first time I'm speaking to Toby, so when I'm going to mention ambassadors, it's not him, okay, guys? It's not him. But when I have dinner, and I've had dinner with many ambassadors like Toby over the past 2 years, most of them are blooded and battle-weary. Most of them are sick and tired of trying to negotiate with people who, at the end, seem to either be behaving in bad faith, telling or speaking out of both sides of their mouth. Now, we have politicians in all countries in the world who speak out of both sides of their mouth, and unfortunately, sometimes we also have to represent them. Now, the problem is, what do you do when you have a constituency and you have the people out there who are expecting you to do something about privacy, and governments who, at best, can do two things. One, put in the right safeguards and the right laws in their own countries in order to protect privacy as best as they can, and two, set an example. And this is where we need countries like Australia, countries like the United States, countries like the United Kingdom to set an example. And it's work in progress.
It is a work in progress, and I think that that's actually a good kind of launch pad into what I was thinking about and I mentioned in the previous panel that I was on, which was about the creation of norms. And you mentioned the group of governmental experts. So we have these international lawyers, representatives largely of states, that are trying to work out what are the laws of war in cyberspace. And, you know, part of Toby's job as a representative of Australia is to also to navigate that. Do we have the Geneva Conventions, for instance, in the digital sphere? What do we do with the ICRC, which has traditionally responded as a humanitarian response in times of conflict? What happens to civilian rights in the context of in times of cyber conflict? And when can there be, for example, a physical response to a cyber attack?
I feel compelled now. I didn't think we'd get into the UNGGE at this conference, to be honest, but if we will, then I need to put a few things on the record and get them straight, because there are so many misconceptions about what governments are or are not doing.
Let's perhaps keep it at a higher level, and perhaps if I don't think anyone is actually too concerned about the GGE here, but I think what the concern is like, how do states operate in an international rule-based system?
So let's put a couple of things on the record. We have all agreed as groups of states that international law applies in cyberspace equally as it does in the online physical world. So the entirety of the laws of armed conflict apply in cyberspace. We now have a set of 11 norms that have been agreed, which are essentially standards of behavior for states in cyberspace. We as a country sign up to those. We've published those. Some of those were formed by countries that we might actually disagree with at times, but that's part of diplomacy, is compromise and creating arrangements whereby you sometimes do have to, back down on certain positions. Where we are struggling is everything below that threshold of conflict. And what you're seeing continually, I'm sure in your daily newspaper articles and online news streams, are countries exploiting everything below that threshold of conflict, which becomes, as you could tell, very fuzzy and from a legal standpoint. So what we're now trying to do, which is an incredibly complicated task, is to actually say, right, well, how does law apply? We've published our approach to how we think international law applies below that threshold. We'll be updating that very, very soon. Again, we're one of the only countries who does that on a regular basis and commits to it and commits to exploring those avenues with various other multi-stakeholder groups. But trust me, talk of Geneva Conventions and treaty language is bad news. If we get stuck into a 25-year cycle of agreeing a legally binding contract, other countries are going to continue to exploit
I would absolutely agree on that front. I think that what we're trying to do, and certainly from civil society's perspective, is to bring existing rights and existing international law into the digital environment, as opposed to creating new treaties, new treaty bodies, new reporting mechanisms, etc.
I agree.
One of the key components of, and seeing we're in the space of warfare, one of the key issues that's and essential actually to this discussion about dystopia or utopia, are we bringing cyber peace or cyber warfare? The reality is that it is a very, very vulnerable time. And part of that is about information warfare. And I might, with that, turn to Michelle, because information is your business, is about the conveyance of information, and the issue of fake news, which has also been raised in this discussion as well. Maybe you can take a little step back, give us a little bit of an introduction, but if you could touch on that issue around fake news and how, as a public broadcaster, you're managing to ensure that Australians, and I think the ABC is the most trusted news source, by a long way, is bringing information that Australians can trust and can converse on, etc.
Well, I mean, thank you for the opportunity to be really part of this conversation. I feel very underqualified, you know, with a doctor and a professor here. But you know, someone introduced me the other day as being trilingual, and I thought, oh well, you know, it's English, Cantonese, and Mandarin. And I was told, no, it's News Corp, Google, and ABC. So, you know, they're very different organisations, and I'm very proud to you know, currently lead the ABC in this real kind of, you know, move to a fundamentally sort of, you know, different environment. Not just a different environment in the way in which we present our you know, news, education, and entertainment to our audiences, but increasingly the way in which we concentrate not just on the news, but analysing the news, making sure that people really understand the context for information rather than just, you know, a presentation of facts. You know, the ABC has been going for 86 years, and frankly, we've been at the forefront and have been trying to be at the forefront of innovation for quite some time. So when you think about it, it's hard to believe, but actually yesterday was the 10th anniversary of Australia's first video-on-demand service, ABC iView. This is, you know, at a time when Netflix was still posting DVDs in the mail, right? So it is quite extraordinary that we have been at that forefront. But it is really about making sure that it isn't just about the platforms that we have ourselves, but increasingly going where people are. Over the last couple of years, we have spent a lot of effort in making sure that our, you know, news, information, and education really reaches people on the platforms where they're spending time. And increasingly, that's Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and you know, many others, including some of the nascent ones like Snapchat. And the important thing for us is making sure that we are presenting that information in a way that is really relevant to as many Australians as possible. So over the last couple of years, we really have gone from close to 2% of the population consuming ABC content that way to now it's close to 20% of Australians actually come to us on these third-party platforms. Now, the challenge for us is really making sure that we are there in the short to medium term, but it's also, you know, as we go the sort of utopian to dystopian continuum, it is, you know, certainly a medium to long-term risk for, you know, the ABC and other key content providers, because ultimately those platforms have their own commercial imperatives. They have their own, you know, changes in algorithm. You know, the recent change in the Facebook newsfeed had massive implications for us in terms of our content reaching consumers through Facebook. But then we now have the rise of a whole lot of other platforms that don't necessarily rely on search or don't necessarily rely on social. They rely on voice activation. So we now on conversational user interfaces on these smart devices. But if you then say, you know, tell me the news. Well, what news? Do you have the ability to set the news that you want to hear? Is there a default news provider that is somebody that has paid to be on that system, on that platform? And how do you make sure that you have an ability to reach consumers in as many ways as possible, but knowing that we obviously have constraints about our ability to be on those platforms if you know, it requires a different commercial model. So, it's important that we really reach beyond our own platforms, but it is incredibly important as well to build on our own platforms. As Brett said, the great news is the ABC is frankly more trusted than ever before. And as trust in media goes down, and as trust in public institutions goes down, the ABC has been that bastion significantly above 80% trust in terms of our news, current affairs, and other content. But it is important that we continue to maintain that, because that trust can be lost very easily. Just one point on fake news. I mean, I am quite conscious that people sort of think of fake news in different ways. So some unnamed politicians think that anything that they disagree with is fake news, right? So we do have to be conscious that there is a real distinction between presenting information and having someone assess that with their own biases and with their own motivations as fake news does not make it fake news. And I'll talk about this a bit later, but I think the ultimate opportunity we have is not just to make sure that we're presenting that news and information in a very straightforward and well researched, with incredibly strict editorial policies that we operate under, but ultimately that we spend a lot of time with the community, but also particularly with our kids on how do you trust the information? What's the source? Making sure that people really understand where things come from, and I think we'll have an example of that. But I'll just tell you a sort of short story about my eldest daughter. Probably about 10 years ago, that she was doing a research into healthcare, and she was probably 7 or 8, and of course she was online doing her research. And I looked at the information that she'd pulled together, and I said, "Where did you get this? I mean, it's just wrong." And she said, "The internet." And I said, "The internet is not all true, right?" And she just looked at me horrified. And I said, and I took her to the WHO website and said, "This, true. This, not so true." How many of us as parents have that conversation with our kids, right? And making sure that in the same way that you necessarily don't trust what everyone has to have a filter around making sure that the information they're being provided is accurate. But making sure that we do that across all of these platforms is really important.
And I think that we might turn to a video now to have a look at and see the real challenge of new technologies, including voice technologies, and their impact and interface with video, and the possibilities of how that content can actually be used for different political agendas. So if we could play the video, let's have a look.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. That's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources. It may sound basic, but how we move forward in the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of fucked up dystopia. Thank you.
So, Ambassador, let me turn to you on that one. As we struggle with many of these issues, and how do we as a nation, or how do we as an international community, is it government responsibility, is it platform responsibility, is it broadcaster responsibility, to help users or citizens or customers navigate content like that?
Sure. It's all of us, isn't it? I mean, if government tried to do that alone, they would fail. If industry tried to do it alone, they would fail. It's about creating, I think, a more discerning consumer of material wherever it might be. And I think very powerful point, well made, is the fact that, you know, so I've come from an academic background, so I was taught as a researcher, you know, don't read the book that you read until you've backed it up through a secondary or tertiary source. So that's something that's already been through an extensive research process, editorial. You know, so I was already not trusting any book that I read until I'd backed it up with other evidence. You know, we're now as a consumers at the point where we are overloaded with information. You know, just think of any one of us who picks up our phone in the morning. You'll have all sorts of news alerts from different news services, Twitter. Your Instagram account will want you to kind of engage on a personal front. There will be some, you know, news coming through your Facebook account. It's a deluge. So, you know, with the limited time that you feel we all have as individuals, you think, oh, well, okay, I'll just read that. Oh, right, maybe that's true. And certainly if you've not been brought up to think clearly about, well, would that person really say that? Does that make sense? And so I think, you know, long-winded way of saying it's the education piece. It's about creating all of us as better consumers of this stuff.
Let me push back on that, just to echo what the e-safety commissioner said earlier, is that it's no longer can be the responsibility, the onus of responsibility needs to shift from the user, from the citizen, back to the platforms or back to government. So here we are in a conundrum where we're looking at content which is coming out like that in many different forms, where governments are using the excuse of fake news in order to silence opposition or to discredit voices that they disagree with. And then this problem, of course, with do we want privatised enforcement? Is it the responsibility of the companies to be able to determine what is accurate or inaccurate news? So maybe I can turn to the Professor in terms of, like, what do you think the international system can do with this? Is there move within the UN system to be able to provide some sort of guidance to broadcasters, to nations, onto how they should navigate this?
Actually, the mood inside the UN, in certain bodies in the UN, because the UN is not one heterogeneous place, right? It is one where on some issues people don't want to talk, so there is no appetite for example, discussing multilateral treaties or anything of the sort, largely because of the difficulty. Nobody's saying that that isn't ultimately the right way in which to address international law. International law is built up that way. So that is an effort which continues in one stream. But also because different subjects have different levels of maturity in the discussion. The maturity in the discussion on freedom of expression has been going on for 20, 25 years and longer than privacy, for example, at one stage. At the same time, however, there are certain parts where that intersects with my mandate on privacy, such as, for example, freedom of expression and reputation, right? Reputation falls under Article 12 and Article 17. And at that stage, you ask yourself, so how are you going to deal with reputation on the internet, right? Do states have a role here? And that discussion, I feel, hasn't really properly started. It needs to be done. And this is very much where a place where I find myself with what Toby was saying. I think it's all of the above when it comes to solutions, and it's also very much a case where we need to make sure that we go, if we were to take the 11 principles that Toby was discussing in a different context, we've got to remember that the devil is in the detail. And ultimately, when we're talking about the many billions of users, current and future, of the internet, what they care about is the following. That if they are working in an internet without borders, they expect safeguards without borders, and they expect remedies which go across borders. And our job is to try and identify those safeguards which we can create and which will take some time to create, and some of those will be easy than others, and all of those will require the multi-stakeholder environment that Toby was talking about. But others will be more difficult, because the minute that you start talking about safeguards without borders and remedies which go across borders, because somebody may have defamed you, offended you, intruded on your privacy, etc., beyond borders, then you start getting to the real problem. And the problem is the devil is in the detail. How do you go dig down into the detail? And it's a very complex issue, which is why it's going to take a lot of time to sort out each one through very complex negotiations. And the best hope I can hold out at present is that you start small and you start things even at a regional level, and you hope that that can grow. Because if you find partners, whether regional, whether across the Atlantic or the Pacific, who are prepared to come together with you on a number of basic principles, as President Obama had said in September of 2015, once you start talking, then hopefully people can coalesce around your position. And that is the value, immense value of diplomacy that you have there, and why we should not be discouraged by all the long and bloody battles that you have behind the scenes and the front of the scenes on the diplomatic front.
Yeah, I mean, the problem, I think, is also that the diplomatic solutions aren't necessarily working when you're dealing with actors in the digital environment that you're not necessarily sure of who they are or where the attack is coming from, who your adversary is, or what shape it may take. I want to bring Michelle back to that video. Any reflections from you on that with respect to the ABC? Like, how do you navigate that?
Well, look, I think ultimately it is, there's two factors at play. One is in terms of the content creation, making sure that at the time that we are doing our news stories, providing education resources to kids and entertainment, that we come from this place of making sure that we are accurate, impartial, that we have done our work, because ultimately, without doing that work, you lose the trust in an instant. We've noticed that we watch our trust numbers on a constant basis, and while our trust has held up and actually even increased, in a quarter, Facebook's trust halved overnight. I mean, it was that dramatic post Cambridge Analytica. So you actually do realise that the only thing you have really going for you is trust. That's why we spend so much time around ensuring that quality and our compliance with editorial policies. Then the other piece is making sure that we are connecting with our audiences and we're meeting audience expectations. And one of the things that I think makes me much more positive about the future than negative about the future is for those big news events, increasingly people are coming to us on mobile, increasingly they're under 40. So this idea that young people are only interested in the Kardashians and the clickbait, it's just not true. I mean, it's fundamentally not true. We will see in the election, in the elections coming up next year, that we will have our biggest audiences ever because, frankly, that's where people want to know whether Anthony Green has called the election or not. I mean, that trust matters. So that's the only thing that you can rely on, both from the time that you're making that content as well as making sure that people really understand that what they've got to appreciate the source of information, and increasingly as they're let down by other sources, they increasingly come back to something they trust.
I think the problem with this is that increasingly, even with the best vetting process and the best editorial process, if Jordan Peele didn't come on at the end, you may never know that the content that you're actually releasing is disinformation.
The question for us, if we and we've had these examples a number of times. If you see a tweet that says something, or you see a video that says something, again, you have to ask, does that make sense? What are your multiple sources? It's not ever just one source. It is going back to the doing the work.
So you raised the issue of elections, and obviously there's next weekend and the ones to come in the following year, but how are you seeing the disruption of, and this is perhaps to you, Toby, the disruption of technologies and its impact on the electoral process? Like, is this something that, when we think about the basic tenets of democracy, it's like that the election is fair, that it's reflective of the voices of the people, etc. How important, how significant is this for you? It's a question that we've got here coming through Slido. What's the take? What are we doing in advance of potential, if we look at other jurisdictions, threats to the elections that we'll have here in Australia?
So it's been a constant actually throughout this job. So I arrived in this job in January last year. And even before I started, I ended up being on conversations around the whole election interference piece in the US. So it's been a constant theme throughout that. I mean, I can give you the kind of stock government answers of things that we have done and are doing, and the fact that, you know, we've pushed out an enormous amount of training to political parties to understand the risks and some of the responses for their own cybersecurity. We are working hard in terms of some of the local by-elections, in terms of looking at the integrity of the election in the online space, so looking at the cybersecurity of online voting systems and the like. So we're trying to prepare ourselves, ready to go for the general election, whenever that might be, obviously. I've got to be careful with anything I say about that being a government rep. Not that I know anything, by the way. So we're acutely aware of it as an issue, and trust me, it concerns all of us, and we wouldn't be good bureaucrats if we weren't thinking about the fundamentals of a liberal democracy, and the fact that if there are those who have the motivations to interfere with that process, well then, you know, it's our job to be able to combat that and respond. Have we seen anything proportionate or of the type that we've seen in the US election, we've seen in the run-up to a number of European elections? No. Is that to say that we shouldn't prepare for something like that? Well, no, we obviously do need to prepare for something like that as well, because, you know, we get this opportunity to learn from what others are prepared to do. And in some ways we've been quite fortunate in Australia to learn from those things. You know,
Fez, are you seeing in the election context here, potentially in Australia, but elsewhere, like a increased violation on the right to privacy in the digital environment in the lead up to or during elections?
Really so, in the sense that we saw that blatantly in the case of Cambridge Analytica, right? We have to remember that Cambridge Analytica's overt pitch, even on its website, was that it's going to help manipulate decision-making, not only in the commercial sector, but blatantly in the political sector. And it does that, and similar organizations, both known and unknown, do that in a way which is subtle and not so subtle, which is try to profile the various bands and individuals on the electorate, and then target thousands, tens of thousands of individually crafted messages to each one. And that is the danger that we have out there, that by permitting means, very often used voluntarily by people through the apps and the APIs contained in the apps, etc., and the information which is collected about them, they are permitting organizations to target them much more effectively. The surprising news to many about Cambridge Analytica was not that it was being done, but about the amount, the thousands of individually crafted messages that were being used already in the different campaigns. And as Toby has said, we've seen that in the United States, we've seen that in a number of elections in Europe, and it's the new form of Cold Warfare, if you want to call it that way, right? That you try to affect regime change or avoid regime change in ways which don't necessarily need you to send tanks or guns or fight proxy wars. And it's pretty scary, but we just have to be wary about it. And as Toby said, we have to try to take all forms of means possible to avoid that happening. And you can only do that through increased cybersecurity.
somebody said here, can you please bring Michelle back into the conversation? Michelle,
Yes.
come back into the conversation. Not that I thought you were out of it. I don't know who asked that question, and we're not asking for personal identification of who that might be. But do you have a reflection upon the upcoming election and the role of the public broadcaster, digital disruption?
I mean, we see our role very much as being a town hall, and making sure that you can have those conversations on multiple sides of issues and discuss them. I think the thing that worries me the most is that sense of kind of balkanisation, right? Which is that I only want to hear messages that reaffirm my previous beliefs, right? And I think that's the big concern I have, that anything that just serves to reinforce my beliefs and everything else is fake and everything else is biased is ultimately where, I do think you get breakdowns in community, and you do, have people sort of not having a common understanding, I guess, of what we're all here for and what we're trying to get done. So that's one thing that, we're very conscious of as we develop our sort of, next, versions of platforms and products, that it is about making sure that it isn't just, I want things that I tend to agree with and only things that I'm interested in. I think that one of the key kind of amazing qualities of the ABC is the breadth and diversity of the things that we have. And, increasingly allowing people to hear things that they don't agree with. And it's about presenting alternative viewpoints. And, increasingly the worry I have is making sure that is, something that people are used to and they're comfortable with, rather than just retreating to their kind of comfort zone of reinforcing previous beliefs.
Toby, there's a number of questions here related to Australia's policies on surveillance, on metadata retention, on encryption from my own perspective. And if we just look at the first one, Australia has a mandatory metadata retention scheme that's in direct violation of our obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. How can we have a cyber engagement strategy that upholds human rights online overseas but fails to uphold them domestically? We're in the last final minutes, but I think it's important that we reflect some of the concerns and the comments that are here about how we actually interface domestically. How do we ensure that Australians' human rights are being protected? And as this inquiry happens over the next couple of years, that we invest in those things to ensure that we have human rights compliance here and internationally consistent with government policy.
This would be a good point to bring Ed back on stage as well and perhaps get his view on this. How do you address this properly? Let me refer to something you said earlier on, which is how do you marry up domestic settings with international positions? And it's not easy, is it? None of this is an easy equation, because we're dealing with new and evolving technologies which are, as we said at the beginning of the conversation, used predominantly for opportunity. And what happens is, unfortunately, there are a few who look to exploit those technologies for malicious intent. So you get stuck between a rock and a hard place. And if you focus on perhaps the encryption discussion, which is so contentious, so we as government fully acknowledge that encryption is just an amazingly awesome piece of technology. We use it ourselves. It enables a lot of what we do as governments. We know, without it, you wouldn't be able to conduct your banking on your mobile phone. Pretty much everything is enabled by encryption, but we do have certain parts of society who look to use that for nefarious purposes. So the dichotomy you get within government is, well, then how do you address that? How do you address that negative use of what is fundamentally an awesome enabling technology? And with great difficulty. So, if we're looking at the encryption discussion, there will soon be an open call for, submissions on thoughts, perspectives on the government's approach to this. And I would thoroughly encourage everyone, as part of a liberal democracy, that you can respond to that. You can have your opinions, and you can put them into the mix and make sure that they're heard within government and considered. But and it's important that we do have that discussion. But the problem that we face now is the ability under certain strict legal conditions for an agency to be able to actually access.
But I think that
encrypted data.
many people and technologists would say that encryption, a weakening of encryption, a backdoor encryption, is not a selective thing. It's not available to some, and they're not available to others.
I mean, that's been made pretty clear that it's not actually a conversation about backdoors. It's not about trying to weaken the fundamentals of encryption.
Let's see how it rolls out. But I think in terms of privacy, the importance of encryption from an international standard has been very clearly articulated by the Professor's colleague, David Kay, as a Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, and by yourself, that encryption is an essential part of the internet, an essential part of the framework going forward to enable freedom of expression, public broadcasting, privacy, security of at-risk populations, etc. So let's just flag that one, and we're going to run out of time. But let's just get some quick concluding remarks from any of you on the discussion. And I also want to somewhat apologise for the sort of broad scope of discussion. I know that we've gone from many different issues, from national to global, from privacy to freedom of expression, from broadcasting to cybersecurity, but I think this is the complexity and the convergence of the topics that we have had on the agenda today and the things that we're going to have to deal with. One of the things that we've worked out as an organisation is that you can't have these silo discussions. I mean, it's brilliant to have these advocates here. You can't have a silo discussion when you think about a utopic or a dystopic future. That's all converged. So,
very briefly, just to address slightly your question about how can Australia square its international discussions with its domestic ones.
30 seconds, I think we have.
I think that one of the best ways to do that would be for the Australian government to take the advice of its a succession of Australian law reform commissions, which have told it quite squarely, you have to beef up your privacy laws. In order to be able to set an example on the international front, you can no longer be in a position where Australia, without a Bill of Rights, without clear remedies at tort for privacy on the domestic front, without a whole range of safeguards which exist in other places, to the extent that it has not been considered, unlike New Zealand, to have adequacy for privacy on the EU data protection front. If Australia starts taking, and it's not the fault of this present government alone, I mean, you have a succession of Australian governments which have not taken the advice of successive law reform commissions. Once you get there, it's part of a continuous process of improving things, and I'm sure that will strengthen Australia's credibility on the international front too.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that.
I'm not going to let that go unanswered, because actually we have corresponded to you, and actually we do feel that we have a pretty strong position in terms of the privacy regulation. From the picture that you paint, it would mean one where no one's privacy in this room is protected, and that's a fundamental distruth. Well, fake news.
I'm sorry, Toby. I understand why you have to say that, but that's the fake news.
Yeah.
Totally not true. Absolutely not true. And you're actually ignoring the correspondence that our Prime Minister has sent you.
What we might do is take the ambassador and the professor offline
calling it out.
to continue this discussion.
I'm putting it back in your face. You are.
I'm calling it out.
I'm
saying that it's untrue. I'm saying get your act together and stop
and we're
trying
saying
to
read the correspondence that's sent to you by the Prime Minister.
I can read perfectly well, and that's why I'm disagreeing with it.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Can I thank the panel, Professor, the ambassador, and the Managing Director. Ed, please, someone take us off stage. Thank you.